everybody, and welcome to today's In Conversation With. Today, I'm joined by Professor Qing Gu, who joined UCL Institute of Education as Director of the UCL Centre for Educational Leadership and as Professor of Leadership in Education in October 2018. Before Qing joined UCL, she was Professor of Education at the University of Nottingham. Qing's research is in the area of teachers' work, their lives and effectiveness, school improvement, and educational systemic change. And her research includes projects with the Education Endowment Foundation, amongst others. Qing has also been a central member of the International Successful School Principalship Project. And today, I'm delighted that Qing is going to speak to us. So now, Qing, it's over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to share with you what we have learned from our research about the importance of school leadership, especially in the wider context of educational reform. As we know from the reality of leading a school, learned from many of our school principals on our research projects, and also both internationally and also nationally, there is that kind of broad and wider debates about to what extent educational policies are actually supporting the practice and quality of teaching and learning in the classroom, and to what extent they are really adding pressures to what matters in the schools. And so in our work, we wanted to focus on what successful school leaders have done and learn from them despite the policy changes and over time. And I think that over time element is quite important. So not playing games, but over time, despite the changing context, despite the change in governments, in policies, we know some schools are able to continue to do well and to make a difference to the learning and achievements of the children. And that really has been the motivation and a driver for us to wanting to research those school leaders and learn from them and share the knowledge about what has worked in their schools and from their leadership practice.
Yeah. But it's interesting, isn't it, how you make the point about how when governments change and when policies change, policy is perceived differently, perhaps, by different school leaders. Would that be a fair thing to say?
I can't agree more with you, Gavin, because policy itself, I mean, our research is not policy analysis, those kind of critical theorists' work. So I need to clarify that. We focus very much on school leadership and how school leaders, especially school principals, interpret, understand those policy texts, and then communicate the policy text with their teachers, with other school leaders on their school sites, and with parents and pupils, and then create the systems, the conditions that enable them, not just simply to implement, but enact. The enactment considers the key characteristics of the school contexts. So enact those policies in their schools that would actually work. And also, so the two things here, I think are maybe three are important. One is when governments, policy makers making policies, they don't actually tell you how to implement those policies. And policies are communicated with the school system in text form. Yep. You're a language teacher, you would understand what that means. It's in text form. Therefore, that process of interpretation, as we have learned from our research and also research internationally, deeply reflects the educational values and identities of each individual school leader. And they are the second thing is related to that is they are almost the gatekeepers of the policy. And then how they make the decisions about the ways they're going to introduce a particular policy to their school to have the buy-in from the teachers within the school. So the fundamental transformation we have learned from our work is from the government policy to our policy. You know, that kind of diagnosis of school context. And here we don't just mean the intake of the children. And actually, more importantly, it's about to what extent the educational values are shared already, grounded in the school life, in the school's life, and the capacity and the capability of the teachers within the school, as well as the kind of culture, the collegiality, whether teachers in the school are teaching behind closed doors in isolation, or actually there is a community of professional learning in the school. All those determine profoundly then the systems, the processes, and the structures the school leaders can embed in the school. So I think those are really important when we consider and look at the policy enactment. And there are also cases we have identified from our research, you know, to what extent the school principal will decide to ignore and or adapt certain policies in their school is also really, you know, really reflects the identity and value. I'll give you an example. I think, you know, help to people to understand what I'm talking here. So in our ESRC, the UK Research Council funded project on how successful secondary schools enact government policies. So all the schools, the case study schools in England, as well as in Hong Kong, we found very similar kind of research findings and the messages. So what we've, so this particular school, all the schools on the project have had at least 10 years of data we've looked into before we selected them. We know that they have showed sustained improvement because we want to rule out those kind of quick fix playing games elements. And so under the Labour government, for example, talking about policy, there was the modern foreign languages were no longer considered in the national tests on the league tables. So schools won't be assessed by the particular exam results relating to modern foreign languages. Then we see in the education landscape, quite a number of secondary schools, in order to save funding budget, they started to reduce modern foreign languages departments or got rid of them altogether at the extreme cases. And we don't believe it was a coincidence that none of our case study schools on the projects removed or reduced the capacity of their modern foreign languages departments. So then under the Conservative government, it was believed that it is essential that our children learn a modern foreign language. So that was brought back to the league table. And you can imagine then those schools that don't have modern foreign languages department or capacity started to jump again, blaming the policy change. And none of our case study schools really suffered as a result. And in one particular school, the head teacher told us they had, so under the Labour government, they had a senior leadership team meeting. Only one question was asked at the meeting: would you send your own children to a school that doesn't teach modern foreign languages? The answer was no, then a decision was made for the school. And I think that for us deeply reflects the value that those educational leaders hold, and then to do the right things for the children in their school, and then create the opportunities for those teachers. And another example we often, we found in the research is, so under the, again, in the older days of English school system, we have local authorities, really, they were in charge of schools. And then there were quite a few of, CPDs, they have consultants coming up with these wonderful ideas about education, and the schools will have to implement them. And there was once in in a case study school in East London, the local authority, the local education authority in those days, somebody came up with 16 values. They thought those 16 values were fundamental to improving schools. And so the school principals and the school principal and school leaders came back after that training session, and they had another meeting. They thought nobody in their right mind would remember 16 values, let alone you have to implement them and enact them in the school. So they looked at the context of the school and they decided there are 4 values that are fundamentally important to our teachers, to our children, to our community. Mm-hmm. So 10 years on, when we started our research with them, those 4 values still remained as what, how they drive the processes and practices and the school policies in that particular school.
And I guess in the back and forth of policy reform, values are what keep some stability in what can be a very turbulent environment.
Absolutely. So we actually say in our work, the policy enactment fundamentally, if you look at it from school leadership perspective, is enactment of their educational values. And we also know from successful schools, their educational values are shared by the staff, by the children. So that's why, I loved one of my favorite quotes from the research was one of the heads told us, it is really important that you stand by and stay true with your own educational values. And then you actually see the policy will, if you stand still, you will find the policy will start dancing around you. And I think that's what you meant about the sustainability. And it's just, can I share another example we had on a different project? I was evaluating the teaching school policy for the DFE, for the Department for Education. And there was one small primary school applied to become a teaching school. They were successful. So those were the early days of the policy implementation. That was my first visit to the school, because it was, a new thing to the school. And I was interviewing a group of year 2 children. So they were 7 years old, about 5 of them. Mm-hmm. And part of the almost responsibilities of becoming a teaching school is you would have to to design and provide CPD training for teachers in other schools, and sometimes the subject leaders of education will have to go to other schools, so leave your own class. Did you hear what I'm saying? So some parents were actually quite nervous. So you take out the best teachers out of my children's class, who is going to be there to teach them? And, we actually found 3 years down the line through the research, and it was conducted actually by Professor Daniel Mudge. He found those teaching schools were getting better. So, that's another way of saying how those school leaders made sure the sustainability in terms of the quality of teaching within their classroom. And what really has worked is this is another policy opportunity. They opted for it and they made it work to be a CPD for the whole school, for their staff. So they are not only teaching children, they have to reflect on their own practices, design CPD programs, and influence the practice of their peers in other schools. And that itself is the best CPD, as we were told on the research project. Coming back to this small school, new into the policy. So I had these 5 lovely children from year 2, 7 years old. So I asked them, I said, do you know that your school is a teaching school? I was expecting to hear no. And, these innocent faces, I can still remember, they were telling me, yes, we know our school is a teaching school. We are very lucky in this school because we have the best teachers. Some other children in other schools are not so lucky. We don't mind sharing our best teachers with them. Mm-hmm. So when I went back and told the head teacher about what I heard, this man in his late 40s, I saw tears quietly coming out of his eyes. And I think that is, that's what I'm getting emotional myself. This is, almost a decade now with the research, but it's still, that's, I think, what matters in education. And that has really kept many school leaders in education. It's all about making a difference to the children and enact their values in ways that would actually make a difference. Because, we actually believe, we do believe, the vast majority of our teachers and school leaders, if not all of them, they love children, they want to make a difference. But leadership is also art. Loving children and knowing how to make a difference to their learning and achievements is a second step. And I do think through research, as researchers, as academics in higher education, it is our responsibility to research those leaders who have, successfully made a difference. That's that shared value and moral purpose. And I think it's that also brought the higher education and the schools together.
Mm-hmm. And that can be a difficult thing to research, can't it? Particularly in the climate of higher education, which sometimes methodologically can challenge us from talking about these broader, more affective terms, if you like. Do you find that? Is it hard to capture something as what could be as broadly perceived as values?
I think so. I think, mental health and well-being, for example, the affective dimension is really one of the three key components of what matters to mental health and well-being. And education, especially, teaching, by its very nature, Andy Hargreaves argued that in the 1980s, teaching by its very nature is an emotional practice. And I think when we also learned from our research on the impact of successful school leadership on student outcomes. There was a large, almost £1 million research project funded by the DFE, the Department of Education in the UK. And we have learned both the cognitive side of leadership practice and the emotional side, the leadership trust, the trusting cultures that school leaders create within their schools, they matter simultaneously at the same level in terms of driving and making a difference to the school improvement process and processes, and ultimately impacting on children's motivation for learning and children's learning outcomes. When I was building, for example, in our large-scale survey of more than 400 successful school leaders in England on that project, if I took out the emotional sides of leadership, the whole model would collapse. That just tells us, although the cognitive and the emotional side, I couldn't build a direct link statistically, but they sit there to show they're equally important. And I think, we also find from case studies what has really kept teachers going in the profession. Deep down are the emotional things, because we talk about the teacher-student relationships, for example, as we know from TALIS studies by OECD. Over the last 3 TALIS studies, surveys, more than, I think, 95% of the teachers reportedly telling us the student-teacher relationships, they play a profound role in terms of fulfilling their job satisfaction in their own classrooms, in their own schools. And I think as school leaders talking about leadership is very much, and it is also a very emotional practice for the school leaders. I can still remember a head teacher told me, he said one of the best days of any year is the day when his children, young people, it's a secondary school, went to the school's site to collect their GCSE and A-level results. He said, the joy on the young people's faces just remind him of why he, is in education. And I think, that's probably said it all.
Yeah. For a school leader, and considering these, if you like, emotional geographies, the flow of the ups, the downs, the things that sustain us, can it be challenging when you're trying to bridle policy coming from central government, perhaps, and you're the principal or head teacher, and sometimes you meet a staff maybe who are split, so you have those who are in favor and those who are resisting? What kinds of strategies, what kinds of emotions do leaders tap into in those instances based on your research?
Right. Before I get to that question, I wanted to share what we repeatedly hear from school leaders, that you can't please everyone in the school. That's practically the reality. And the most important thing is to create that collegial and collaborative culture within the school where you can harness the hearts and minds of the majority of your teachers. And that would create the kind of social capital that is needed to ground any kind of changes. And the social capital, I can't emphasize enough about the importance of relationships in schools. And that is, again, I would say the educational philosophy and the values about what the school stands for is the social glue that really bring the teachers together. So, and that is the foundation. And then we can talk about when a new policy comes in. I'm just thinking of how to answer a question. There was I was giving a training at a NPQH, so National Professional Qualifications for School Head Teachers course. And one of the participants asked about the future proofing. So with all the policy changes, what is the future proofing? And I think that is really important for school leaders to understand and not to lose sight. The quality of the teaching is the future proofing. Doesn't matter how the policy changes, to continue to focus on developing your teachers and to provide the professional learning and development opportunities and environments that will enable them to feel, the majority of them, if not all of them, to feel fulfilled as professionals in their classrooms within the school. And that is your future proofing, because that comes with the best quality in the classroom teaching. And we know classroom teaching practice is the strongest predictor of students' academic outcomes. So it comes in that kind of sequence. And leadership support for professional learning and development is the antecedent for everything else to happen. And that is also the sustainability. And going back to the question about sometimes teachers will have different views, and those kind of the social intellectual foundations that already built in the school are very, very important. And also the other thing is change takes time.
Yes.
And changing people's mindsets takes time. So there was one particular example I want to share here. Hopefully that will directly and indirectly answer your question. One of the case studies schools on our ESRC project. This school has been under the leadership of the heads for I think six plus years by the time we started following the school. So it has been outstanding by Ofsted inspection judgments for at least 2 terms, being outstanding school. So what that means is there is the teachers' capabilities within the school, the culture within the school, the connection with the parents, with the children. There's a good solid foundation. Yeah, understanding that is important. Then, so in English schools, children with special educational needs are assessed, they will have a statement. And so there has been critique of that kind of statement, depending on how it's perceived by school leaders. Because the negative side is it could cap the growth of the child. So you are a child with this label. That's pretty much labeled your identity and caps your potential in some schools, as we know. And in this school, so the school leader, the school head teacher, principal, has a very creative mind. So he decided to remove all those statements from children's files, because for him, it simply means each child has different abilities to learn. It's as simple as that. It's about meeting children with different learning needs. Rather than labeling the children. So it is more important, he believes, believed that teachers think about meeting the learning needs of my children rather than talking about children with a label. And that language change would, the discourse change would impact on, of course, the culture change, then the practice change. And it wasn't easy. So when we interviewed the middle leader who was actually leading this change, and his own child happened to be a child with a statement in a different school, and he thought the head had just absolutely gone mad. He said this wouldn't work. But what the head also puts in place at the same time is changing the language. So everyone is a learner in the school. Even the teachers are learners in the school. Because, as I talked about earlier, the importance of developing teachers, and the teachers need to learn and develop themselves, and same with children. Teachers have different learning needs. It's the school's responsibility to cater for that. And yes, so then they have CPD provision in place to help teachers to understand how to better cater for children with different learning needs. And the kind of language culture shift, it took a couple of years to then for the middle leader to say to us, I just can't believe I'm actually telling you now, I'm a deep believer of this, that every child learns differently. It's our responsibility to find out how to support them. I hope that's a kind of example to show. But of course, it's not easy. The Ofsted and the government came in asking for the statements. And so then the school leader the principal told us in the following Ofsted inspection, he was asked for the statements and he explained about the practices, but he was grilled for a good 40 minutes around his values and practices and strategies. Although in the end, the school, because in his view, the school outcomes, value added and attainment outcomes, progress outcomes and attainment outcomes spoke for themselves. Nonetheless, it wasn't easy, although in the end, after the inspection, the school was still judged as outstanding. That emotional process of going through to convince the outsiders, he said he cried for 40 minutes in the corner of his office. So, I think it is important also for us to understand the kind of risks that those school leaders take when your values are not closely aligned with the policy, and how you actually reform that, and the importance of ownership, the culture, the ownership that you create within your school is ever so important. There are other examples I probably don't have time to share with you, but I hope that just shows why, we then firmly believed as researchers, we need to learn more about those practices that really have worked.
I think it's interesting when you were talking about the NPQH, the leadership development work. Do you think maybe we can do more there to shift people's mindsets about policy a little? Because sometimes, I don't know about you, but you can meet people who really firmly believe and they have an emotional connection to policy as document, policy as accountability. Policy is something which can't be changed. In other words, quite a managerialist view of policy. I'm hearing, when I hear you speak, somebody who in your case study has put the leadership into policy. And I'm wondering if through leadership development, then therefore, we can do more to help. I mean, inevitably it's going to be emotional, but possibly through more structured supports and talking about this, more research, we can actually support people to manage those emotions a little better for themselves, so the impact isn't so great, maybe?
Yes, I mean, that's a beautiful summary, Gavin. I can't agree more with you about what you have just said. And we are, as a center, the UCL Center for Educational Leadership, we have been running MPQ programs for 25 years. And recently, we are the only university-based provider for MPQs in England. And we do firmly believe that it is, and that's how we see us as being different as a provider for MPQs, because although, have to be careful about what I say here, although, we have to create a program that's aligned and in terms of fidelity, I don't love this word. I think I've said enough, but we have to create a program that's very much closely aligned with the kind of framework created by the government, by Education Endowment Foundation. Nonetheless, we think the added value we can provide as a university, as a research-intensive university, is to share research as additional resources with our participants, with the future leaders of the country, and I do think that Education Endowment Foundation has done a great job in terms of creating a kind of mindset. We need to look at evidence. We need to look at research. And I think it's about enabling our future leaders to understand the priorities, not losing sight of the priorities of being a school leader. There are so many policies. If you go onto DFE's website, any kind of national government website, you can get yourself drowned in all those. So it is really about understanding what is the future proofing for my school, what really matters for the teachers and for our children. That is very much about developing them. And I think then to understand, to create a kind of mentoring and coaching scheme. And we are very careful about who we select from our programs and mentors and coaches, because we don't believe in, as a center, a kind of a list-like competence-based in isolation, everything, every single, this kind of competencies matter, this kind of practices matter. It is really important for school leaders to understand, to make the isolated, to create the connections between those practices and underpinned by what you believe is right for the children, to diagnose the needs of the children, the needs of my teachers, and then to create the systems and the processes and the cultures that would work. And again, another important element, we think it is important for school leaders to understand, not only vertically, the cognitive and the emotional leadership practices need to connect, but horizontally, schools development is an ongoing process. The context would always change, the policy would always change, and staff would come and go in many schools. So school development actually is, we identified school development phases. So I think it is important for school leaders to understand those foundations that matter for each phase. Doesn't matter where you are in terms of your school improvement trajectories. Those are the foundations, like the values, like the kind of relentless focus on developing teachers. but also then to understand to what extent those values are shared widely across the school, whether I can introduce, for example, the distributed leadership or not. Mm-hmm. So I think those are important. And related to that is the accountability. And I think accountability has been now discussed in ways, has a very negative correlation to do with, but we tend to discuss in our leadership programs the importance of internal accountability. The policy changes, those, in England, for example, the offset, those are external accountabilities, but the internal accountability is actually more important, because that is something that really brings together the values of teachers within the school to share to share the understanding about their roles, their responsibilities in education within their school, within their classrooms, and therefore give them the inner drive to continue to improve themselves so that they can continue to teach to the best to their children. And so I love, one of my favorite books is by Richard Elmore. It's called The New Accountability. I mean, it's not a new book anymore, but in which he really connected the internal accountability with the staff development and argued very strongly, those matter, those things matter. I mean, policy will change. Another example I can probably give you is the linking to accountability is the performance-based pay. That was introduced to the English system as a policy. Then, there are a lot of concerns and quite understandably about why, because head teachers will make the judgment on whether you get a pay rise or not, and whether you won't have an automatic progression in your pay. That's linked to performance. Well, who judges the performance? So you can understand the kind of the nervousness, and we have identified a lot about those tensions and challenges within schools. But one of the case study schools we have studied in our projects is this head teacher. Again, has been a good. It wasn't outstanding school based in Ofsted language. It was a good school. The new head took over the school, and she had an ambition to take the school to a different level. When the policy was introduced, the performance-based pay, what we have heard from the teachers, from the middle leaders, and I think that fascinates us, because that's a better way of studying the impact of school principals' leadership. And they talked more about it is our responsibility as educators to continue to improve us, and the schools would create the communities of learning, would bring in external voices and new ideas to help us to grow. And of course, then, through the kind of consultation process, that's how we enact the performance-based pay within our school, being discussed in subject groups, in across different departments at the faculty level, and then brought up to the school level, and the consensus were reached. And what was driving that was teachers want to make a difference. I mean, again, going back to the values, and that's, I think, is fundamental to the understanding of internal accountability. Some people would argue it's a professional accountability, which is equally a powerful concept. And they actually believe it is, if anyone who doesn't want to grow and didn't want to improve your teaching practice, you are not doing the service to the children, and you don't deserve a pay rise. And it was quite interesting to hear that. And so what we have learned is this particular policy, through the consultation process and through the CPD provision, what the school leaders has created are opportunities to anchor the values, opportunities to create and anchor the ownership of our policy, and the opportunity again to continue to enhance the capacity. So I think those three opportunities they have created using this policy again is taken the school. We can, contributed to why the school in 3 years' time become outstanding school. And that wasn't the purpose of why school leaders lead a school, but I think it just gave the evidence to hear that coherent discourse about the values, the ownership, and the sense of pride about making a difference. We hear from teachers, from middle leaders in those schools.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful the way you talk about middle leaders, and so much of what we're talking about, I think, also raises the notion of that internal accountability with the values as building, as Andy Hargreaves and Fulham would call it, professional capital, which allows you to sustain yourself in, as going right back to where we started today, the ups and downs of what inevitably will be policy change and the environment in which we live, nested within the macro policy context and our school community.
Absolutely. I think that's, that professional capital will underpin the decisional capital, because you have to trust the quality of the decisions. They are the right decisions for the children, for the school. Yeah. So, and again, but who creates the professional capital? They don't just land in the school. And again, that goes to leadership. And this is where we fundamentally believe, not only from this research on policy enactment, but also a range of research, we repeatedly kind of seeing the centrality of leadership, the importance of leadership in terms of creating and building, sustaining collegial collaborative cultures that would enable the professional capital to be, to have a life. So, we had a discussion talking about at the NPQs when we were designing the program. We just had to have a conversation with those people who make the assessment on the fidelity of our programs, because the comment was made, leadership was part of the culture, although we agree to some extent. But I think it is really important for our future school leaders to understand school principles. You create a good culture, you can also break a good culture. And, you are part of it, you live in it, but don't forget you create that, or you can break it. And I think that's fundamentally important. And then to learn from research, from case studies, from the best practice about what has worked and how together we can make a difference. And I think another thing I want to say about leadership development is the pedagogy. It is really important for us to create a learning communities for our school leaders on our programs, and that's embedded in the kind of platforms and the structures that we create for people who enrolled on our MPQ programs, especially for senior leaders, school principals and CEOs. In the Chinese language and culture, we have a saying, it is very cold and remote when you are at the tip of a mountain, to describe senior leaders. You're basically alone. That kind of pressure, the isolation. So they do need professional and emotional support as well. So to create that platform, which would enable them to share best practice, but with challenges from facilitators, from mentors, from coaches, so that they learn in triads, in communities. And that is really important. And we hope some of the communities created during the programs will carry on. I mean, that will develop organically. But I think that's that kind of opportunity, just to pick up a phone for a senior leader to say, I'm really struggling, to have that trust. It's really important, I think, emotionally as well, and fundamental to supporting their well-being, the kind of leadership well-being. It's really important.
Qing, I could keep going all day talking about this stuff, but before we wrap up, I'd just like to give you a chance to mention anything maybe we haven't got a chance to talk about today that maybe you'd like to spotlight about your work or future work, or things you think that maybe more researchers should be focusing on before we part ways today?
Thank you, Gavin. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity. One other thing I really wanted to mention is the mental health and well-being in schools. As we know, because of COVID and because of the COVID didn't. I think what COVID has done, as we know from research also from UNESCO, from World Bank, Save the Children, it really amplified, highlighted a lot of the pre-existing challenges. Let's not pretend that those are new challenges, the attainment gap, and what kind of children are less likely to access the online learning. And that goes back to a lot of the fundamental social issues, social cultural issues, social economic issues. We can date back to the Victorian time. Yeah, but I think COVID really amplified those kind of challenges that we are facing in modern times. And I think well-being and of the children has become a really key issue. But children, not just the children, schools also, I mean, for us as a center on educational leadership, we want to research more about leadership and teacher well-being. And because unless you have resilient, happy teachers, you are less likely to have resilient and less, happy children. I think, that's kind of logic. And, but a lot of the policy language we have seen, and even in the research landscape, also in practice, is about a lot of schools, even in universities, trying to create the dialogue about well-being. I wanted to, that's something we want to research more, because I think I haven't heard enough, and certainly we've learned from our research on teachers' subjective well-being, is there are hygiene factors as educational, as educators and researchers, we need to consider not necessarily just the happiness and well-being. The mental health is not just about me feeling happy, therefore reducing workload will just make me feel happy. Actually, the strongest predictor of teachers' mental health and well-being, as we've learned from our research, are two things. The strongest predictor is actually their self-efficacy, the beliefs that they are able to make a difference, therefore having the inner drive to learn to overcome the challenges. And the bottom line is you are able, as a teacher, you are able to teach well so that you can feel you are making a difference, feeling fulfilled. And that is a fundamental. And happiness, we argue very strongly in our work, is not just a psychological phenomenon. It is a social phenomenon, because for teachers, if we consider, the nature of teaching is a vocation, has its social understanding, social significance. And for teachers to feeling happy, that is related about, to making a difference to children's learning and to make a positive difference, therefore to the advancement of the society. I think those are the things. And the other important factor about mental health is the value that teachers hold, and how therefore, as researchers and as policymakers, we are able to bring our kind of intelligence together to have a much more nuanced understanding about mental health issues in schools. And it was interesting, one of my PhD students just presented some data on mental health in schools and mental health in leadership, especially relating to teachers and school leaders. Workload has the weakest contribution to their well-being. It is what goes on in the organization in terms of culture, in terms of the opportunity to build the capacity and the capabilities for the teachers. As therefore, the enhancing their self-efficacy, those things, and then the relationships with the children matter most to teachers' well-being. And I think that is, I want to end with the 3 M's. It wasn't our 3 M's, it was the 3 M's actually identified by some school leaders in their work for the DFE about a teacher's workload. When we think about teachers' well-being, and I think research more is how to make the workload and the nature of teachers' work and lives more meaningful. Teachers understand what they're doing is meaningful. They can see why they're doing it, and more motivational. So they can understand how they're making a difference to the learning of their children and to the learning of themselves. And of course, the third M is manageable. So how much they do is, of course, has to be manageable. And that, again, is a leadership consideration. That's, I think, what I want to say about thinking of our future research.
Qing, thank you so much for being so generous, both in advance of today and sharing so much expertise based on so much sustained research in such broad but in fundamentally connected areas. It's been so rich to have this conversation, and I know it's going to benefit a lot of other people too. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you for the opportunity. It's always really rewarding, I think, certainly for me, and I think for my colleagues. That explains why we're doing research. And so this kind of opportunities is just really meaningful for us. And I am very, very grateful as well.
Thank you so much.